All right, everyone, welcome back from break. We are going to transition to our next presentation. Next up, we have Bruce Houlihan from Orange County Crime Laboratory. Bruce, take it away.
Okay, you can see me okay and see my screen well?
Yep, coming through loud and clear.
Great. Well, it's good to be with all of you. I want to thank Matthew and FTCOE for giving me this opportunity to talk about how we provide solutions, both with data and this process. So really the real big question I think that you could start with is, why are crime laboratories involved in this process at all? And traditionally, we have been kind of like a black box or a clinical laboratory, if you think of this, where you give a blood sample, you get a cholesterol result back, or you give us a sexual assault kit, we'll give you a DNA profile, and that's it. But as we've gone through this multi-year process, not only here in Orange County, but I think nationally with the crime laboratory directors, by default, some things have emerged, and one of those is the service providing that crime laboratories actually can do. So by default, we're becoming a hub of information and a way of facilitating some of the change and implementation and even efficiencies that are actually going on nationally with this process. So what you can see in the graph that I have here, these are direct conversations we have not only with stakeholders, but people of interest in the information that we have. But this extrapolates also to not just the kits themselves and how the kits are handled, and I'll talk more about how Orange County has done this, but in what's going on with the data. So there's a tremendous opportunity, I think, for the forensic service providers to be included in this dialogue and to facilitate some of those solutions that we're all really working on from many different angles and different perspectives. And this has certainly been the case for us here in Orange County, and I think we've been able to implement some things that have really helped us in this jurisdiction. So some of the challenges we're actually facing as we begin to provide a greater role in some of these solutions is to maintaining the security and the confidentiality, not just of the kit, but the data, of course. Because we have so many different stakeholders that we have different needs, we have different formats of data, we have different uses of that data. And so maintaining this idea that is very diverse in terms of input and output on some of this information. There are some really strongly focused groups on what needs they actually have. Law enforcement has their needs, the sexual assault nurses have their needs. The forensic service providers provide scientific information, but legislators are actually looking for certain things. So collating and organizing this data so that we can actually provide a cohesive approach to some of the solutions is one of the reasons why I think crime laboratories have some opportunity. And not the least of which we've already heard from Dr. Speaker and others about the statistics, the cost, the processes about how we actually do these things is key to our discussions as well. And of course, legislative mandates are already here in many different forms, not just turnaround times, but how the kits are analyzed and so forth. There's also a piece with this our service to the survivors, right? So this is indirectly, of course, with victims groups and the investigative groups, but many of us are actually providing websites and direct information for the survivors, if not the state, the crime laboratories too. And of course, we still have to facilitate communication with our clients. So these are some of the things that are actually driving some of the dialogues that we actually have. Well, when we move to talking about what we do with actual data, it's critically important that we protect and encrypt this data. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides. But the potential for problems if we mess this up from the beginning are huge. And so we want to make sure when we're designing solutions that this is foremost in our mind, it's not an afterthought. We really need end-to-end encryption, the data needs to be protected, and a survivor needs to be able to say, there is no absolute way that any information that you have is going to be able to be released inadvertently. So that's one of the key things that we need to maintain. Part of that is how we store the data securely. But from that, we have to be able to cull the information for the statistics. And when we're reporting where the kits are, when we're asking what's the most probative sample type for the CODIS information that we're actually generating, getting that information out from the sexual assault examinations is important. As we talk to each other and as we share data, both statewide and with the crime laboratories and among crime laboratories, maintaining standard data formats with that exchange and agreeing ahead of time how we're going to do things will help us save a lot of time later. We are dealing, as you've heard, we're dealing with a tremendous number of cases that we actually have to work with. So being efficient in our operations, and that includes automating our reports, automating our analyses without mistakes, our goals as well. Many laboratories are moving to paperless processes. In California, we have an electronic sexual assault examination form with the nurses. I'll talk more about that form in a minute. There are some jurisdictions that are still dealing with paper itself. So how that information gets off the paper so it actually can be used for efficient data collection and storage as part of our process. Crime laboratories also have LIMS systems, which organize everything that we do, from reporting to evidence control to website publishing. So getting information in and out of our LIMS system is something that makes a huge difference in how well we do our job. And finally, on this slide, we're actually dealing with not just new casework coming in. Orange County, we're dealing with cases that go way back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and how we process that. There were no computers back then, and all that information is on paper, on microfiche, and really, really old formats. So how we integrate that data into what we're doing is critical as well. So what we're trying to do, I think in our overall perspective, at least for us as a forensic service provider, is not only maintaining confidentiality protection, but we want efficient analyses, but we want it comprehensive. We want to do the best job that we possibly can in the shortest amount of time, so the best value, really. We want our solutions to be high reliability, so you can trust the information that you're actually getting. So when the decisions that you actually make, they're going to be good decisions. There needs to be some auditing and tracking and reverse look capabilities on your entire process, not just for error correction, but actually for anticipating ways you can improve things later. As we automate, one of the goals of automation is to eliminate things that are redundant. I hate entering the same information twice in multiple systems. There's really no excuse for that now with the computer systems that we have. So to automate this process not just saves us time, but it prevents transcription errors. And there are a lot of advances in scientific technologies as well. Those that have a DNA lab understand that the technology changes almost monthly with how we do things. Making sure your data systems can facilitate that kind of change in a positive way, and so kind of an agility type thing or an adaptability thing is crucial to making sure that we have a successful system. Okay, so let me start with our first poll question. I want to talk about some of our history in Orange County, but let's talk about our first poll question about when you ask that question about how many untested sexual assault kits there are, how reliable is the response going to be?
The poll has been launched, and the results are coming in pretty quick. We're up to about 30% participation rate. We're going to try and get it up to 60 mark, and then we'll share the results with the audience. At about 50%, we have 47% only approximate and 46% saying having very accurate numbers.
Because that's really good. I would like to have asked this question about 6 years ago. I was a bit Pollyannish when I began asking this in Orange County with our law enforcement partners. I thought we had very, very good information. It turned out we didn't. And it's very good now, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit, but I think we've actually made some improvements here, especially nationwide, that are actually moving us in the right direction. That's a good thing to see. So I'm going to give you some context a little bit on Orange County's history so you understand why we've done some decisions and where we've come from. I want to talk a little bit about how we redesigned our case stewardship, or managing the information, protecting the information, and using the information for the best results. I'll talk a little bit about how we actually should form these solutions so that things are protected. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we collaborate together with these data systems. So historically in Orange County, we started really this whole dialogue about reforming this in about 6 years ago. Every jurisdiction in the state was handling things different. It was not just the kits, it was the data that was collected. Our LIMS systems were actually different. The processes were different. It was very unpredictable. The forms that the nurses actually used were different. The evidence kits were not standard. and I'll show you in a minute, but the perspectives on whether or not sexual assault kits should be analyzed, whether you should do all of them, which should be analyzed, very, very different among all of our partners. There was minimal tracking other than what the labs had. And since the labs did not have most of the kits, that was not as good as it could be. And our predictability about how long it took to process these kits was not as good as it should be. So we began, when we were working with legislators, and we began this dialogue saying, whether should we analyze every single kid, or what's the status? And we began talking to all of our partners in the state. Some of the responses that we actually get. So from law enforcement, no, you don't need to do these kits because the victim recants. False accusations are very common. The information is not reliable. Just every kit is not necessary, right? And you've probably seen some of these arguments. From our legislators, every kit must be analyzed regardless of the circumstances, right? The victims have a right to have the kits analyzed. And law enforcement is losing a lot of kits. We know these kits are actually lost by law enforcement. From our prosecutors, it doesn't matter what the victim says. This is the crime scene. We have a right to analyze these because we want to search these samples to see if the perpetrator actually committed something, even if it was consensual, right? So sometimes different perspectives in what the prosecutors wanted to do versus what the survivors actually wanted to do with their kid. The survivors are saying and telling our nurses sometimes, don't analyze my kit unless I approve. I may want to ask this later, but they are asking what's the status of my kit. And when we began asking the lab's typical response was, we don't know how many kits there are because we don't get them. They're being held in the law enforcement property rooms. And if we start analyzing all the kits, this becomes an unfunded mandate. And so we're now completely unprepared for being able to analyze all these kits. So in our jurisdictions, the process went something like this. So the victim sometimes would transport themselves to the sexual assault nurse facility. Usually the law enforcement would take a report or transport that victim themselves. The law enforcement would drop the survivor at the hospital, and they would wait until the examination was complete and the kit was actually collected. The kit was then given to the law enforcement officer. They would then transport that back to their facility. It would be logged into their property, and they would then decide, the investigators would actually decide when and if this needs to be sent to the crime laboratory or for the provider for the analysis. When the analysis is done, it would go back to the law enforcement facility. So we wanted to simplify this, and that's the process that used to be is on the lower right again, but I'll talk more about this slide in just a minute, but there was a tremendous inefficiency in actually having these kits go back to the law enforcement agency and then to the crime lab. And so one of the first things we realized as we began studying how can we do a better job analyzing all these kits is we said, why don't we just take the law enforcement out of the kit receipt at the beginning completely? Not only did we say, to the law enforcement, we want these kits, give us every kit, give us the historical kits, but we began asking, is there a way of doing this better where we don't even have to ask them and depend on them giving us a kit? Why don't we just get the kit directly from the hospital? And that's when we worked with all of our law enforcement in Orange County, this was a tremendous success story for us because everybody said this is a much better way of doing it. So we, as a laboratory, collect the kits directly from the hospital and directly from the nurses and begin the process. We know that we're getting 100% of the kits submitted. We don't have to worry about where the kits are unanalyzed in the law enforcement, but the law enforcement, number one, they don't have to wait at the hospital or the facility for the examination to be done to transport the kit back. They can be released to go back to patrol. Number two, they don't have to worry about the stats. It's a greater burden on us as a crime lab, of course, because we have to report how many kits there are, but they don't have to worry about where their kits are because every kit comes directly in the laboratory for the analysis. This has been a huge benefit to Orange County because it solves a number of questions. How many are still sitting on the shelves? None, right? Every kit goes directly to the laboratory. That's great. Now, the historical kits were a different issue, but this was a big win for us, and it's been tremendously helpful. But now we had to manage the data, right? Because this process is very manual. There's information in the sexual assault nurse examiner form that we need to get. How do I get the information into my LIM system? How do I get it to the prosecutor? How do I get it to the law enforcement agency? How do my sexual assault examiners use the information in the form to make their critical choices about how to analyze the case. We take a very critical approach. We look at every case differently. We do whatever's needed on that kit. So we're not just looking at a minimum set of or maximum set of swabs on the kits. So the information that's in the nurse examination form is very, very important to us. And what do we do about the historical kits, and how do we prioritize these historical kits? So before I look at that, let's do another poll question about state mandates.
All right, Bruce, the poll has been launched. For those of you in the audience, the question is, what is your state mandate to test all kits? No mandate to test all kits within 60 days, within 120 days, and only submission mandate, no testing mandate. We are at about 30% participation rate right now, so we'll give everybody a few more seconds to get their answers in. Looks like we've stalled out, so we'll go ahead and share those results.
So here in California, we're at submission at 120 days. Testing, it's escaped me now what the testing deadline is, but most states are working not only to submission deadlines, but to testing deadlines. This was not a problem for us, but now that we're dealing with every historical kit that's ever been on a shelf, going back decades, we had to take different approaches to actually analyzing those kits. So if your state is not doing this, I guess this is the takeaway. If your state is not doing this, they will, right? So I think preparing for this is a good thing. So as we begin reforming this process to do a better job, we want the kits to be standardized. We want the sexual assault forms to be standardized so we can code the data. We wanted to standardize how electronic data was actually exchanged and pulled. How those kits are actually submitted to the laboratory. Like I said, we're going directly to the hospitals. We want to be able to track the location, the process of all the kits. We want the statistics to actually be appropriate and accurate. We want our reports to be consistent and accurate as well. And we want to make sure that our communication with our stakeholders, and there's a lot of stakeholders now, because we're talking to the nurses, we're talking to the legislators, we're talking to government officials, we're talking to law enforcement officials. A lot of people are very interested in this. This is one of the reasons why having a crime laboratory as a hub is a very good thing. So when we asked where all the kits were, of course, we got many different answers from the law enforcement agencies. The older the kits are, the more ambiguous and fuzzy the answers got. Of course, a lot of this was being done before any kind of electronic systems or electronic records even existed. A lot of these kits were analyzed with very different technology, not just different DNA technology, but also with conventional serology. The question, of course, is who stores these kits? Is it the crime laboratory or is it a law enforcement agency? And we don't have this anymore in California, but there used to be a statute of limitations on these crimes as well. So all of these are questions that have to be answered when you're looking through this process. So again, we decided to analyze all kits. We wanted to pick up the kits directly from the hospital, not involve the law enforcement agency, so we knew we were getting 100% of the kits. I would encourage you to do this if there's any way you can, because it solves a number of problems and removes a number of questions that you'll have to answer if you're not doing this. We did have to have a plan for the historical kits. It was a second phase for us, and we're kind of halfway through that second phase right now. And the historical kits we did have to prioritize, mainly by crime type, of course, but we did a lot of triage too. So that's important because there's a lot of them. And so which ones do you send first? The sexual assault nurse examiner's form is electronic and is done like on a laptop, for example, or in a tablet type of computer. The advantage of this is the information is stored in text form and it can be extracted, but you're actually working on a form, mainly a PDF, in an electronic fashion. So both the form itself that the nurses use and the data inside that form, which is key, can be culled and extracted from that. But what we found is that even though it was more work for us as a crime laboratory, if we handled the communications as a hub for all this entire process, it solved a number of problems for our partners. They were a little skeptical at first, but they found that it helps them, relieves them of some work, and it gave us much more reliable information as we publish this. So again, The sexual assault kit doesn't go back to the law enforcement agency. That's the big thing. But when we pick up the kit from the hospitals, we are actually transferring the information from the sexual assault nurse examiner's form directly into our data systems, use that information for the analysis, and then disseminating that information in a secure fashion to the police departments, the prosecutors, and other partners. So law enforcement, of course, is talking to the prosecutor, but now the prosecutor can talk directly to us for information, just like law enforcement is going to be doing. And we have one channel or one direction where all the information is actually flowing. So if you're able to do this, I'm not sure with most of the states how standardized your SANE forms are, but I would encourage the states to have standard forms, making them electronic, making sure that the information in the form can be extracted as text or XML characters that you can actually read and import into a computerized system, making sure that your fields are clearly identified so you know what you're looking at. So if I have a field called name, is that the survivor's name? Is that the agency's name? Parsing those fields out is actually very, very important. And making sure that you're enforcing formats, so when you're organizing, collating, and indexing the data, you actually know that your information is clean. So organizing the form in that fashion is very important. So in addition to the physical kits being taken from the hospital, one of the tactics we actually took was to control the flow of data from the nurses. So the nurses in the upper left will collect information on a standard form. We wrote a custom application for the nurses. The nurses have this application that extracts the data. It verifies the data, making sure the agency numbers are correct. It encrypts the data on site, and it transfers that data to a crime lab and our sheriff department owned secure store for the information. Now, I'll talk more about why that government or sheriff owned secure store is important, but what we wanted to do in encrypting this data is pulling it from the form. We extract the field data that we actually need, as well as the native form. And in this encryption, it's critical that we develop from the get-go what's called RSA, which basically is two passwords. You have a password for encrypting it that everybody can know, and you have a password that's secure for the laboratory to decrypt it. So the nurses have a password to encrypt the information, and that's no problem, but they can't give that password to somebody else to decrypt it, right? So a shared password, like you might give your Uncle Tony your password to your Gmail account, right? That's what you don't want to do. We have to protect this data. And so an RSA system to actually doing this is key. So keeping it under control of a law enforcement agency, and then the crime laboratory pulls it from that site, then decrypts it in a secure fashion, integrates it into our LIMS system, allows our sexual assault examiners to actually have direct access to the forms. And then information is distributed in a minute. I'll talk about how to the prosecutors and the law enforcement agencies through our protected websites, with the full understanding, of course, that victim information is protected. So I mentioned how getting the information as text, so that text can actually be used for counts, categorizing. You don't want to read handwritten text if you don't have to, because it's just a nightmare. You want to make sure that the data is integral as it transfers, so you don't have to retranscribe it. Transpose errors don't exist. Security needs to be done by public and private keys. And try to be paperless as much as possible, because it's going to facilitate the automation that you actually have. So our sexual assault examiners do a lot of decision making as they're triaging each kit. So when they're looking to see the circumstances of the case, what kind of swabs were actually collected, what's the best way to look at this kit, they're looking at the information that we've culled from this SANE form. And so handling that in a digital fashion really streamlines the analysis and the processes that we have, in addition to, for the prosecutors and the law enforcement investigators. They can get this information directly from us now, directly from the sexual assault nurse examiners. And as we, down the line, publish this information for the victims and the survivors, as well as to some of our state reporting agencies, this information is now available and secure from the get-go on 100% of the cases. So just from my own knowledge, let me ask everybody how your nurse examiner forms are actually collected now.
All right, the poll is launched. Are you able to extract data from the SANE forms? no, they're handwritten, yes at the state level, and yes at my level. Answers are coming in pretty quick. We're already up to 30%. The leading number at about 40% is they're handwritten. And looks like our results are slowing down.
Yeah, so this is a tremendous opportunity. I think moving from handwritten to text information that can be extracted is one of the best decisions we can actually make from the beginning, because it really can facilitate a lot of efficiencies in the process. So I would encourage you to consider that as you move forward at your state levels. I mentioned that as we're stewards of this data, we have to be very careful that this information is protected from the beginning. I mean, all it would take with one case where the survivor's information would be compromised would do tremendous damage to our processes. So we have to do the best encryption and the best public safety storage of the information from the beginning. I'm not comfortable with cloud-based solutions because as a third party that has the data in hand, and even though we have contracts, requirements about what they have to do, and this kind of information, it's just I'm not comfortable with it. So most jurisdictions will now also have requirements for in-place encrypting of every piece of private information. You can't just store a file. It has to be stored, it has to be encrypted when you store it. So take that consideration. HIPAA is a good example of this. So maintaining not just transfer encryption, but also how you store it and encrypting the data is key. If you are emailing sexual assault nurse examiner forms now, please, strongest recommendation I can give you is change that process. Set up a secure website transfer if you have to, but do not email this information. It is public. It can be either a man-in-the-middle attacks, and it's a strong vulnerability for the information. Some jurisdictions are even going to not just passwords and two-factor and so forth, but you also want to be able to track and audit who's using the information, who's receiving it. The way we distribute this information to our clients is the information is not actually stored on our website. The availability information is they request it, and then we send it back in a secure fashion to our clients. That way, if the website is compromised because it's public facing, you don't have to worry about information on the box that the website is on actually being released to the public. Before I talk about how this is published, let me ask two questions. First about, do you have a tracking site for the kids?
The poll is up. So does your jurisdiction have a tracking site? The answers are none, FSP, crime lab site, prosecutor LE site, state site, or more than one of the above. Answers are coming in pretty quick. And it's actually a pretty even split between none, FSP, crime lab site, and state site. Give everybody just a couple more seconds. Never mind. There it is.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's pretty expected. And what about now for survivors? Do survivors have direct access to the data for tracking? So once the information is collected and facilitated through the crime laboratory or the provider as a hub, this can now really facilitate how the information actually gets to your clients. You can control the context about who gets it, how they get it, whether it's the information as data or it's an information as a form. You have the ability to track it, control it, and that includes, of course, the code of searching and so forth that are with it. So at the front end, working through the process to improve it can really help you downstream for the prosecutors, for the legislators, for the law enforcement agencies that are your primary clients, and for the survivors. We give much more authoritative answers now when our legislators call, for example. A password, of course, protection is a given, but as I mentioned, I would encourage you not to store information on public websites. Have a separate, secure way of actually doing this. Our district attorneys, for example, communicate with us through a controlled private network. They don't go through the internet. This is one of the ways that we actually control distribution, but we want to be careful about maintaining secure stewardship of this data. Think through clouds, which is a vendor-provided computer on the internet for storing things. I've used this slide before. And if it's innocuous data, that's one thing. But when we're talking about very sensitive information, vis-a-vis something about an assault or survivor information or the circumstances of the case, you don't want this even to be available or potentially have the availability to the public. So rethink about how the stuff is actually stored in the cloud if you can. For survivors, when you provide information on a website, I encourage you to think about having anonymous ways of referencing this information. So make sure your identifiers that you're giving the survivors can in no way be associated with the timing of the case, the circumstances of the case, the aging, and so forth, making sure it's a completely anonymous and randomized identifier for the websites. That will help them trust that the information is actually going to be secure. But we're actually soliciting grants, of course, to be funding these processes a little bit more. So maintaining your data electronically internally can also help when you're actually talking to the state tracking systems, which we all have now too. So these are the 4 areas I concentrated on to try to improve this data management, data shipping. The forensic service providers really become a good hub for facilitating this process. We are unbiased scientists in the information that we provide. We're advocates for the evidence, but we're also public stewards in that we can actually help this process and help the delivery, the answers that are given, and the questions as well. We have so many stakeholders as crime laboratories that the questions come from different angles. And if we have to go, talking to 10, 20 people to get that information, it becomes even more difficult, as I'm sure it is in your case. So having one place for that information is great. Most of the laboratories are also very tech savvy already. We know how to manage scientific data. So implementing these software solutions are already second nature for us too. So again, I mentioned extracting the data, try to have standard forms, making sure you get at the text. Please make sure encryption is end-to-end and the best kind. Be cognizant of how the information is retrieved and stored. And your forensic service provider, if they're working well, can actually provide very, very good statistical information as you're working through these projects on your own. So again, thank you for giving me an opportunity to share with you today.
All right, thank you, Bruce. With that, we're going to switch over to a little question answer discussion. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Bruce. That was amazing. We learned a lot. We got a lot of questions coming in, so I hope you're ready. First question we're going to tee up for you is, how do you attribute the appropriate law enforcement agency and when that kit comes straight from the hospital? I'll ask you that one first, and then I've got a follow-up on that.
So say the first part of the question, how do I attribute?
Essentially, the kits are coming directly from the hospital to you. How do you attribute the appropriate law enforcement agency to that kit?
Okay, so our sexual assault nurse examiners have that information. They have the agency's case number. They know the officer. That's actually put into the form. We call that information from the form.
Okay, so I think
that can't be done.
I think the second question becomes moot. Who assigns the incident number? And it sounds like that's the hospital.
Well, yeah. The investigators give it to the nurse. The nurse transfers it into the form, and then we pull it from the form. So it's directly the agency's case number.
So Bruce, this is Deb. What if that's an anonymous kit and it's not being reported to law enforcement? Then where does that number come from?
Yeah, so that's not very common for us, where there's no law enforcement agency. On those kind, the nurses keep them. We don't see them.
Okay, and then I have another question. Who physically transports that kit from the hospital to you?
Our property and evidence technicians.
Okay, so I, as the SANE, would complete that kit, call your organization, you actually send someone to pick it up.
Yeah, we go regularly, twice a week.
Okay.
One of the advantages we have is that we only have 1 to 2 facilities in Orange County. So we're not going to, 30, 40 across the state. So Orange County is very populous, but we're small, which helps that.
Okay. And then another question, your hospitals are under mandate to submit the kits, correct? So you're not concerned that they're getting lost at the hospitals, right?
No, again, the number of, the number of sexual assault groups that we have is very, very small. So we have a very tight working relationship with them. The agreement is really between the sexual assault nurse examiners, the law enforcement agencies, and the crime lab. The hospitals are just a site that lease out their areas, right? So we work, we worked with the nurses, we worked with law enforcement, and of course with the crime lab when we facilitated the process.
Sounds like a great system. Who monitors those kits being moved in, and what kind of teeth is behind that if there's an issue?
Well, we have, of course, our entire evidence control and our chain tracking every time we start touching a kit here in the crime laboratory. Law enforcement doesn't get any kit anymore. So it's really between the nurses, the kits they've received, and the kits that we pick up. And there's 100% agreement in that. So unless there's a law enforcement investigation that's happening without the nurses, which my understanding, it never happens, we're getting 100% of the kits. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. And then I had one last question. You mentioned you have an electronic form. Is that standardized for the entire state of California, or is that just in Orange County?
It's California. Yeah, another thing the crime laboratories were able to help with this, and the state, to their credit, invited us in this process, is we talked about what the kits should contain, but we also talked about what the forms were containing. And to their credit, they did a really bang up job on this, because the forms are very comprehensive, but again, they're electronic. You use them on a computer, but the information is stored in text form and XML form, so you can actually extract it and get the information you actually need from that form. So it was done very well, but it is statewide, yes.
Thank you. Excellent. Matthew?
Bruce, there's some questions coming in. One from Pauletta. She's wondering about, this was obviously a cultural change for you. How have you educated on this? What information do you have to be able to share with others about making that transition from law enforcement doing this to more of the hospital directly to the lab?
Yeah, I probably could give a full day seminar on this. It wasn't a trivial process. We started this about 6-7 years ago, before legislators even began talking about these mandates. We could read the writing on the wall, and we were getting these anecdotal comments about where sexual assaults and this kind of stuff. So we knew this could be done. And so we didn't really think about doing, collecting every kit. We were just looking for how can we do a better job with this. But as we began talking about it, we realized, why don't we just stop all these questions just by getting every kit? Now, my DNA staff kind of went through the roof for a few weeks, because they realized what that meant, and my property staff meant how much time and energy it's going to take. But law enforcement, of course, began asking, why do you need to do this? Are you analyzing every single kit? But once we opened that dialogue, it really wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. The law enforcement said, or if you're willing to accept the cost, sure, we don't care. And we tried to, by making things electronic, we minimized the stuff that our staff had to do in entering it and so forth. So it really wasn't that bad from that point. But like I said, we have some advantages in that I don't have 6 sites across a huge state that I have to go to, to collect these kits. So that helps a little bit. And so if you're, your state-based system, you're going to have to figure out how to do that. But I was really proud of our law enforcement, because though they had some skepticism at the beginning, after about the 3rd conversation, they all bought into it easily and agreed to partner with us. And that agreement from them is really what sealed the deal.
How about your staff? You mentioned that it was a cultural change for them. How is that different now, or is it different?
Yeah, I think most everybody understands why we're doing this and agree that this is a good process. They still see a lot of work. There are still a lot of kits where we don't get probative information. Of course, we know that as lab people. It doesn't change the fact that we need to do that. So I think all of our staff are on board with this. When we're looking at the number of historical kits that we had, which was kits that were older, let's say, than 20 years, we're dealing with thousands of kits. That's a big hill to climb. And people, I think, were overwhelmed by that. So it's taken us 2 years. We're not done yet, but we will be by the end of this year, hopefully. So that was a bit of a challenge. Who's going to do these? Where's the money to do this? What is it going to do to our normal turnarounds? So It's taken a little bit of work, but I think everybody is agreeing this is the best thing to do.
Do you have that information? Again, you can share with us what is the average intake? What are we looking at as far as backlogs, things like that?
Sure. I think we have about 600 historical kits now left to do from about 1,800 when we started. Our turnaround times right now, this is primarily because of COVID supplies that were unavailable last year, but we're at a 4 to 5 month turnaround on regular casework right now. I expect that to be down to 2 months by this year. Our backlog on those kits is about 200. Is that what the information you're looking for?
Yeah. How many do you get in a month?
We do about 600 to 800 a year. So about 60 cases, 70 cases a month.
Now, transition that we have an attendee asking about, their word is courtesy reports. I think my word would be law enforcement assists. So where the kit is collected in a different jurisdiction, say it's in a different county, even in Florida, or maybe Florida, maybe California, sorry. But if it comes in from somewhere else, how does that flow into your laboratory if it's ultimately going to be investigated and prosecuted in Orange County?
Yeah, if we're doing the analysis, and generally that means it's going to be prosecuted here, it's handled the same way. It's brought to our normal nurse facility. They will collect a kit, and information gets transferred to us with the same case number. Even though it's an outside Orange County agency, we do those occasionally. If it's going to be analyzed by a different laboratory in California, or it's going to be prosecuted in a different place, there are different facilities where they drive the victims to.
There's a lot of discussion on the chat pod. You'll see in a second, I'm sure. You haven't had a chance to monitor as you're presenting, but a lot of discussion about paper forms versus electronic forms, and you talked a lot about that. Thoughts on converting, struggles that you've had?
Well, I certainly would get everybody together to figure out what they need. It's a losing game having so many different standards and formats, because you can't predict how things are going to be sent to you, how to get to it. So everybody needs to get together and decide what they're going to be collecting. Electronic PDF forms are really not that complicated to make. One of the benefits of standardization is that you can have everybody in larger jurisdictions actually talking the same language. And one of the things that Foresight did at the very beginning, working with Dr. Speakers, we had to define what a case was, what an item of evidence was. That definition and nomenclature at the beginning standardized how we do things, so we're all talking the same language. So when you have a form and you want to collect the time between the evidence collection and the assault, standardizing that everywhere so you can use that information to make decisions and conclusions later is critical. But once that's done, having an authoritative source actually make this form so it's electronic and can be stored as text is really not that difficult to do. You just have to have a central authority and everybody who's participating agreeing to be owners or users of that.
I think Patty Melton's ears have perked up several times as you've been speaking about doing a one-day webinar on how the transition happened, and several other things that you've shared about how to make paperwork into electronic forms. Bruce, we're going to have a bunch more questions for you, I think, in the next segment. So I think that's where we're going next.